A rich man and a woman spent a quiet day in Alaska. Nothing was asked. The morning in Alaska did not announce itself. It simply arrived. Light slipped through the cabin window in a pale, diluted blue, the kind that made time feel undecided. Snow rested against the glass without falling, as if the world had paused mid-breath. Inside, the cabin held its shape. Wood. Clean lines. Nothing extra. Nothing missing. Daniel Frost was already awake. He stood at the counter in thick socks, grinding coffee beans by hand. The motion was steady, unhurried. Each turn sounded deliberate, measured against the quiet. Outside, the temperature hovered just below zero. Inside, the air carried warmth from the stove that had been lit hours earlier. Daniel did not look at the clock. He never did. The kettle began to steam. He poured slowly, watching the water darken the grounds, letting it take the time it needed. No phone, no music, just the low sound of heat and the faint pressure of silence doing its work. Behind him, the floor creaked once. Lena Harper had woken without urgency. She moved through the cabin as if it were already familiar, though she had not been there long. She wore a wool sweater pulled down over her hands, hair loosely tied, steps light enough not to interrupt anything already in progress. She did not say good morning. Neither did he. She opened the cupboard, took down a mug, then paused. For a moment, it seemed like she might put it back. Instead, she reached for a second one. She set both on the table, side by side, not aligned, not staged. Just there. Daniel noticed. He did not react. He carried the coffee over and filled both mugs. The steam rose and disappeared into the light. He sat. Lena sat across from him. No ceremony. No exchange. Outside, the wind brushed the cabin wall, testing it lightly. Inside, nothing shifted. They drank. The coffee was strong, clean, the kind that stayed with you without asking permission. Lena looked toward the window, tracking the faint line where snow met forest. Daniel followed her gaze, though neither of them named what they were seeing. In Alaska, the landscape did not need explanation. It simply existed, indifferent and exact. After a while, Daniel stood and reached for his coat. Heavy, neutral, well used. Lena watched him pull it on, noticing the way he moved, as if every action had already been considered earlier, long before it happened. She grabbed her own jacket from the chair. It was lighter, practical, enough. Outside, the cold was immediate. It pressed against skin and breath alike. Their boots sank into the snow with a soft resistance. The trail ahead was not marked, but it was familiar enough. Someone had walked it before. Maybe them. Maybe someone else. It did not matter. They walked in parallel. Their steps were not synchronized, but they adjusted without looking. When Lena slowed, Daniel did too. When he stopped to adjust his glove, she waited without turning back. A husky appeared briefly ahead, then circled back, tail low, eyes alert. It checked on them, then moved on again, confident they would follow. No one spoke. At a bend in the trail, Daniel shifted his weight and brushed snow from a low branch. The movement revealed a thin scar along his wrist, pale against the cold. Lena saw it. She did not ask. Daniel noticed that she had seen. He did not cover it. He simply continued walking. The trail opened slightly, giving way to a stretch of quiet that felt wider than it looked. The forest thinned. The sky expanded. For a moment, it felt as if something might be said. Nothing was. They turned back before the cold decided for them. Inside the cabin again, Lena removed her gloves and placed them near the stove. Daniel hung his coat, leaving it closer to her side of the room than his own. He did not comment. She did not acknowledge it. Later, as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward amber, a sound broke through the stillness. Not loud, not urgent, just the subtle vibration of a device placed face down on the table. Daniel glanced at it. The screen lit briefly, then went dark again. He did not pick it up. Lena noticed the change in the room, the smallest shift in rhythm. She did nothing to interrupt it. She poured more coffee into his mug, then into her own, and sat down across from him. The wind outside picked up, then faded. Nothing was asked. Nothing was explained. And yet, something had begun to move. The cabin settled back into itself as the day continued. Alaska had a way of doing that. Once the door closed, the outside world did not linger. The cold stayed where it belonged. The wind pressed against the walls and moved on. Inside, the air held steady, shaped by wood, heat, and habit. Daniel Frost rinsed the mugs at the sink, water running just long enough to do the job. He set them upside down on a towel that had already dried halfway from earlier use. Every object in the cabin seemed to know its place. Nothing waited to be decided. Lena Harper moved a chair closer to the window and sat with a book that remained unopened. She watched the way light shifted across the snow, how it changed tone without changing direction. In Alaska, daylight did not rush. It stretched, lingered, then withdrew on its own terms. A husky lay near the door, head on its paws, eyes half open. Every few minutes, its ears twitched in response to sounds no one else reacted to. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped. The dog did not get up. It had already decided there was no reason to. Daniel added another log to the stove. The fire responded slowly, flames adjusting rather than flaring. Heat moved outward in quiet layers. Lena pulled her sleeves down over her hands and leaned back, letting the warmth reach her without asking for it. Outside, the temperature hovered well below freezing. Inside, it was enough. The afternoon passed without markers. No one checked the time. No one announced the hour. Snow fell briefly, then stopped, leaving the world looking unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. Daniel stepped outside to clear the front steps. The shovel made a soft, scraping sound against the wood, steady and unremarkable. Lena watched through the window. When he finished, she opened the door and handed him a pair of gloves without comment. He took them, nodding once, and pulled them on. They stood for a moment in the doorway. The cold rushed in. The warmth held. When the door closed again, the cabin returned to its contained stillness. Later, Lena prepared soup on the stove. Simple. Vegetables cut evenly. Water brought to a low simmer. Daniel set the table, placing 2 bowls and a loaf of bread between them. No special arrangement. No connection. They ate in near silence, the kind that did not need to be filled. The dog shifted closer to the stove, stretched, then settled again. Its breathing was slow, even. Outside, the sky began its gradual turn toward dusk, blue deepening into something heavier, more certain. As the light faded, the lamps came on one by one. Their glow was soft, deliberate, yellow against wood. The windows reflected the room back at itself, doubling the sense of enclosure. Daniel reached for a book and read a few pages, then set it aside. Lena stacked the bowls, washed them, dried them, and put them away. No one told her where they belonged. She already knew. The cabin creaked as temperature shifted. The sound was not intrusive. It was a reminder. Alaska adjusted constantly. You learn to listen or you learn to leave. The husky rose and padded toward Lena, resting its head briefly against her knee before moving back to its place by the door. She did not pet it. It did not ask. Outside, the wind picked up, then lost interest. Inside, Daniel checked the stove once more and lowered the flame. He placed an extra blanket on the back of the chair, closest to Lena. He did not mention it. She noticed later and used it without looking at him. The day continued to narrow, not with urgency, but with precision. Somewhere beyond the trees, the world kept moving. Roads carried traffic. Fullness hung. Decisions were made and unmade. None of it reached the cabin. Here, the routine held. Heat stayed in. Cold stayed out. Light dimmed, then stabilized. The dog slept. The fire burned evenly. 2 people shared a space without rearranging it to fit themselves. Nothing was resolved. Nothing needed to be. Alaska did not ask for more than this. Morning returned the same way it always did in Alaska. Without announcement. Without negotiation. Daniel Frost was awake before the light reached the trees. He moved through the cabin quietly, not because silence was required, but because it was already there. The floorboards responded under his weight with familiar sounds. He knew which ones spoke and which ones did not. He adjusted his steps without thinking about it. The kettle went on first, then the stove, then the fire. He did not rush any of it. Outside, the temperature sat well below freezing, hovering near 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, The cabin held at a steady warmth. Not comfortable in excess. Just enough. That was how Daniel preferred it. Enough was a complete measurement. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold, breath forming a slow cloud in front of him. The husky followed, stretching once before trotting ahead. The snow was firm from the night before, carrying weight without complaint. Daniel shoveled a narrow path from the door to the woodpile. Each movement was controlled, efficient. No wasted effort. No pause for adjustment. He worked until the path was clear, then stopped exactly when it was done. He carried the logs inside 2 at a time. Not because that was all he could manage, but because it kept the rhythm steady. Capacity did not need to be proven. Inside, Lena Harper woke to the sound of the door closing and the faint knock of wood meeting stone. She sat up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and stayed where she was. There was no need to step into the routine. It was already moving. Daniel stacked the logs neatly by the stove, brushed snow from his sleeves, and poured hot water over coffee grounds. The scent filled the room without spreading too far, contained by the walls and the quiet. When Lena entered the kitchen, he was seated at the table, reading. The book was hardcover, its spine uncreased. He had already marked a page, not with a slip of paper, but by memory alone. She poured herself coffee. She did not ask if he wanted more. His mug was already full. They ate breakfast without planning it together. Oatmeal, toast, fruit cut evenly, not for presentation, but because it cooked that way. Daniel washed his bowl immediately after. Lena followed, drying it and putting it away. Afterward, Daniel checked the weather report pin near the door. It was handwritten, updated daily. Wind increasing by afternoon. Snow likely by nightfall. Nothing unexpected. He nodded once and put on his coat. The day unfolded through small, repeated actions. Daniel split wood. He repaired a loose hinge on the back door. He measured out supplies and wrote nothing down, trusting that he would remember. Lena organized shelves in the lodge space attached to the cabin, aligning books and supplies not by title, but by use. At midday, they shared soup reheated from the night before. Daniel adjusted the stove flame lower than necessary, letting the pot take longer. Time was not something he tried to save. After lunch, he stepped outside again, this time to walk the perimeter of the cabin. He checked the roof line, the windows, the lock on the shed. Each point received the same attention. Nothing more, nothing less. The husky stayed close, stopping when Daniel stopped, moving when he moved. No commands were given. None were needed. Inside, Lena wiped the counter and left a second towel folded beside the sink. Daniel noticed it later and used it without comment. The afternoon stretched. The light shifted. Shadows lengthened across the snow, then softened as clouds moved in. Daniel returned to the table and opened his book again, reading a few pages at a time, then pausing to think or not think. It was hard to tell the difference. Once his phone vibrated in his pocket. He did not take it out immediately. He waited until the vibration stopped, then removed the phone and turned it face down on the table. He did not check the screen. He did not silence it. He left it exactly where it was. Lena saw this and continued what she was doing. As evening approached, Daniel prepared dinner. Simple. Protein. Vegetables. Heat applied carefully. He plated the food and set it down. Lena joined him. They ate. Afterward, he cleaned the stove, wiped the counter, and turned down the lights. Lena placed the chairs back where they belonged. The dog circled once, then settled near the fire. The routine held. There was no statement made, no conclusion reached, no change announced. And yet, with every repeated motion, something unseen continued its slow adjustment, working quietly, exactly as intended. The snow returned in the late afternoon, not suddenly, but with intention. It began as a thin drift, barely visible against the trees, then thickened enough to soften the edges of everything it touched. The cabin absorbed the change without reaction. Inside, the temperature held steady. Outside, Alaska adjusted the terms. Daniel Frost was at the table when Lena Harper came back in from the lodge side, snow clinging lightly to the hem of her coat. She brushed it away near the door, careful not to bring the cold farther inside than necessary. It was a small thing. Daniel noticed it. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She hung her coat where it had been hanging before, boots lined up beneath it, and moved toward the stove. The husky lifted. Its head acknowledged her presence, then settled again. Daniel closed the book he had been reading and slid it aside. Not because she had arrived, simply because he was finished. Lena filled the kettle and set on the stove. She did not ask if he wanted tea. She did not offer coffee. She prepared it the way she always did, letting the sound of heating water settle into the room before it could demand attention. The light outside faded faster now. Snow pressed against the window in quiet layers. Inside, the lamps held their ground. Daniel adjusted the flame beneath the kettle, lowering it slightly. Lena watched him do it. She did not comment. She did not correct him. She simply continued. She set out 2 cups, not matching, not arranged, just placed where hands would naturally reach. When the water was ready, she poured slowly, letting steam rise and disappear into the space between them. Daniel waited. He did not reach for his cup until she had finished. No signal passed between them. No acknowledgement was required. They sat. The snow thickened outside, turning the forest into a softened outline. Wind followed briefly, then lost interest. The cabin held firm. Lena took a small notebook from her bag and opened it. The pages were blank except for a few lines near the back. She did not write immediately. She rested her pen across the fold and looked toward the window. Daniel did not look at the notebook. He did not ask what she wrote. He returned his attention to the fire, adjusting a log that had shifted slightly. At one point, the kettle clicked as it cooled. Lena stood and moved it off the stove, setting it aside without breaking the rhythm of the room. Daniel noticed how easily she moved within the space, how nothing in her motion suggested inspection or evaluation. She was not measuring the cabin. She was not cataloging him. She was simply there. The snowstorm outside strengthened enough to dull sound entirely. Even the wind lost its edge. Alaska became quiet in the way only heavy snow could manage. Lena spoke once. Not a question, not a statement meant to go anywhere. The light goes early when it does that. Daniel nodded. Yes, that was all. The silence returned, unchanged by the brief exchange. It did not collapse. It did not demand more. Lena closed her notebook without writing and placed it back in her bag. She noticed Daniel's phone on the table, face down, untouched since earlier. She did not glance at it again. She did not shift her posture. She did not wait for him to react. Instead, she stood and folded a blanket that had been draped over the chair. She did it carefully, aligning the edges once, then letting the rest fall where it wanted. She placed it near the couch, within reach, then returned to her seat. Daniel watched this, though he did not turn his head fully. Later, when the stove clicked softly as the fire settled, Lena added another log without asking. She chose one that would burn evenly, not fast, not slow. She adjusted it once, then stepped back. The warmth spread. Daniel felt it before he acknowledged it. Outside, the snow reached a point where visibility shortened to less than 100 feet. Roads would close soon. Anyone moving through the forest now would turn back. The world beyond the cabin narrowed, intentionally. Inside, nothing needed to change. Lena washed the cups when they were done, dried them, and returned them to the cupboard. She left the cupboard door slightly open, then noticed and closed it again. The correction was subtle. Daniel saw it. He did not comment. As evening settled fully, the lamps became the only source of light. The cabin reflected itself in the windows, creating the illusion of depth where there was none. 2 figures moved slowly within that reflection, unhurried, unmarked by urgency. Lena checked the door latch once, more out of habit than concern. Daniel watched, not because he needed reassurance, but because he recognized the action. When she finished, she sat again, this time closer to the fire. The husky shifted, placing itself between them, head resting on the floor, body angled so it could see both at once. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The phone remained untouched. Nothing was asked. Nothing was taken. Nothing was promised. And for anyone listening, for anyone who had ever learned to lower their voice to avoid disturbing a room, there was something familiar here. Not dramatic, not fragile, just present. Sometimes that is enough to stay. The snow eased sometime after nightfall, not because the storm was finished, but because it had said what it needed to say. By the time Daniel Frost stood from the table, the cabin had settled into a deeper quiet. The fire burned low but steady. The husky shifted near the door, lifting its head as Daniel reached for his coat. "I'm going to clear the steps," Daniel said. It was the first time his voice had broken the stillness with intention. Lena Harper looked up from where she sat near the fire. She did not ask if he needed help. She did not offer to come along. She nodded once, as if the statement fit neatly into the shape of the evening. Daniel stepped outside. The cold met him immediately, sharper now that the snow had stopped moving. He worked methodically, pushing fresh powder off the steps and path, restoring the narrow line he had made earlier. Each movement was controlled. No urgency, no delay. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Lena stepped out with a second shovel. She wore boots better suited for the snow than the coat she had chosen, but she moved comfortably, testing the ground before committing her weight. Daniel glanced over. She did not explain. They worked side by side, not mirroring each other, but sharing the same rhythm. Snow scraped against wood. Breath fogged and faded. The forest watched without comment. When the steps were clear, Lena stopped first. She rested the shovel against the railing and brushed snow from her gloves. Daniel finished the last section of the path, then did the same. They stood there for a moment, the cold pressing in from all sides. "You can leave the shovel there," Daniel said. "The wind will not move much tonight." Lena nodded. "Good." That was all. They went back inside together, closing the door firmly, sealing the warmth back in place. The husky rose and circled once, then settled again, satisfied that the perimeter had been handled. Lena hung her gloves beside Daniel's without looking to see where his were. She removed her boots and lined them up neatly, leaving space between them and his. Daniel noticed. Later, as he poured water into a pot to heat for washing, Lena took a towel from the shelf and placed it on the counter within reach. Not folded perfectly, just ready. "Thank you," Daniel said. She looked at him briefly. Of course. The words did not stretch beyond what they were meant to be. They cleaned the kitchen together without assigning tasks. Daniel washed. Lena dried. When the last dish was put away, neither lingered to check the work. The fire shifted, sending a soft crack through the room. Daniel adjusted the log, careful not to stir it too much. Lena moved a chair closer, then stopped, leaving space between them that felt intentional, not distant. They sat. The husky placed itself between the chairs again, tail tucked in, head down. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "The weather should hold until morning," he said. "If it does not, we will know early." Lena nodded. "I'm used to that." He glanced at her just long enough to register the tone, not the content. Outside, the sky cleared slightly, revealing a faint wash of stars. The light reflected off the snow, bright enough to cast shadows without a moon. After a while, Daniel stood and reached for a blanket from the shelf. He hesitated for half a second, then handed it to Lena instead of placing it on the chair. She accepted it without surprise. "Thank you," she said. She did not wrap it around herself immediately. She held it for a moment, then draped it over her shoulders, settling back into her seat. Daniel returned to his chair. The space between them remained unchanged. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time in Alaska did not always move in units that mattered. The husky shifted again, this time pressing briefly against Daniel's leg before settling closer to Lena. Neither of them moved to adjust it. Daniel's phone vibrated once on the table. He looked at it. He did not reach for it. Lena noticed, then looked away. Instead, she stood and checked the latch on the door, pressing it once to be sure. She returned to her seat without comment. The fire burned lower. Daniel added another log. Lena poured water into 2 glasses and set one near him. He nodded. They drank. Nothing about the moment suggested anything beyond what it was. No curiosity. No expectation. Just 2 people sharing the same temperature, the same light, the same quiet. Outside, the forest held its breath. Inside, the routine adjusted, almost imperceptibly, to include one more presence. That was the only change. Morning did not break cleanly. It arrived in pieces. Light filtered through the trees in uneven bands, catching on snowdrifts and the edges of the cabin roof. The temperature had dropped overnight, settling near 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold pressed harder now, deliberate, patient. Daniel Frost was awake before the husky stirred. He sat at the small table near the window, boots already on, jacket folded beside him. In front of him lay a thin stack of papers and a compact laptop, closed. The papers were unmarked from a distance. No logos, no letteridad visible. Just wait and order. Lena Harper noticed the change before she noticed him. The cabin felt different. Not louder, not tense, just altered, the way a room feels when a chair has been moved slightly off-center. She paused near the stove, mug in her hands, watching Daniel without stepping closer. He did not look up. He opened the laptop and powered it on. The screen came alive quietly, brightness adjusted low. He placed the papers to one side, aligned once, then left them as they were. The husky lifted its head, glanced at Daniel, then settled again. Daniel worked. Not hurried, not hidden. His fingers moved with familiarity across the keyboard. Not fast, not slow, purposeful. When he stopped, it was because something was finished, not because he was thinking. Lena waited. She did not ask what he was doing. She did not pretend not to notice. Instead, she sat at the opposite end of the table and opened her notebook. She wrote 2 short lines, then closed it again. The pen rested where she left it. Daniel adjusted the angle of the laptop slightly, positioning it so the screen faced away from the window. He took out his phone, placed it beside the computer, face up this time, and checked it once. No reaction followed. He sat back down. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the cabin wall without urgency. Snow slid from the roof in a soft release. Minutes passed. Lena poured more coffee into both mugs. She slid one toward Daniel. He accepted it with a nod, eyes still on the screen. "Do you need the table later?" she asked. The question was neutral, practical. Daniel considered it briefly. "No," she nodded. "All right." She stood and moved toward the back of the cabin, gathering supplies she would need for the day. Gloves, scarf, a folded map she had not opened in days. Daniel remained where he was. The work continued. At one point, the husky stood and stretched, then moved closer to Daniel's chair, resting its head against his knee. Daniel shifted his legs slightly to make space. The dog stayed. Lena watched this, expression unchanged. After a while, Daniel closed the laptop. He did not sigh. He did not linger. He stacked the papers, tapped them once against the table to square the edges, and slid them into a plain folder. He did not put the folder away. He sat on the shelf by the door. Lena noticed that too. "You finished?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. Nothing in his tone suggested relief. She did not follow up. They ate breakfast without ceremony. The routine held. Bowls washed, counter-wiped, stove checked. Daniel put on his coat. "I'm heading out," he said. Lena looked up. "I will be at the lodge." He nodded. "I know." He opened the door and stepped into the cold. The husky followed, eager but controlled. Lena remained inside, listening as the door closed and the sound of boots moved away from the cabin. Time passed. The lodge was quiet, as it usually was this early. Lena arranged supplies, updated a handwritten log, and restocked shelves. Her movements were steady, unremarkable, necessary. Through the window, she saw Daniel return sooner than expected. He did not come back empty-handed. He carried a long wooden beam across his shoulder, balanced carefully, as if weight distribution mattered more than speed. He set it down near the side of the cabin, then returned for another. Then another. Lena stepped outside. "You do not have to fix that," she said, gesturing toward the shed where one of the support beams had begun to sag months ago. Daniel looked at it, then at her. "I know," he said. "That was all." He set the beam in place, measuring by sight alone. He adjusted it once, then again. The fit was precise. Lena stood back, hands in her pockets. She did not thank him. She did not stop him. She watched. Daniel worked until the structure stood straight again. He tested it with a firm push. It held. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his coat, and picked up the remaining tools. "That will last," he said. "I know," Lena replied. Their eyes met briefly. No recognition passed. No assumption formed. She turned and went back inside. Daniel followed later, setting the tools where they belonged. The afternoon moved on. Daniel returned to the table and opened the laptop again. This time he worked longer. His phone rang once. He answered it. Yes, he said. A pause. No, another pause. That will not be necessary. Silence stretched on the line. Daniel did not fill it. Understood, he said, and ended the call. He closed the laptop. Lena had heard the call from the other room. She did not react. She continued sorting through supplies, pausing only to place an item back where it fit better. Later, as the light began to fade, Daniel stepped outside once more to check the path. Lena joined him this time without being asked. They stood side by side, looking out at the narrowing world. You could leave, she said, not turning to him. Daniel looked at the trees. Yes. You are not, she added. No, he said. That was the extent of it. They went back inside together. The fire burned evenly. Dinner followed the same rhythm as the night before. When they finished, Daniel reached for the folder on the shelf, then stopped. He left it there. Lena noticed the hesitation. She did not comment. The husky settled between them as the room dimmed. The work had been done, not because it was required, not because anyone asked, and for the first time, the quiet raised a different question. Not about who Daniel Frost was, but about how long he planned to stay doing what he did not need to do at all. The quiet after dinner did not behave the way it had before. It lingered differently. The fire burned lower, its light moving across the walls in slow patterns. Outside, the temperature had fallen again, settling close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabin responded with small sounds. Wood contracting, a faint tick near the window, Alaska adjusting. Daniel Frost sat in his chair, hands resting on his knees, posture unchanged. The husky lay between him and Lena Harper, breathing evenly, rising and falling as if it were keeping time for the room. Lena moved first. She carried the plates to the sink and washed them without turning on the overhead light. The lamp near the window was enough. Her movements were careful, not cautious. When she finished, she dried her hands and stayed where she was for a moment longer than necessary. Daniel watched this without turning his head fully. Something hovered in the space between them. Not spoken, not acted on, just present. Lena returned to her chair, but did not sit immediately. She adjusted its position slightly, pulling it back an inch, then another. The distance between them increased by almost nothing, but it was enough to be noticed. Daniel noticed. He shifted his weight forward, then settled back again, choosing stillness over correction. The husky lifted its head briefly, sensing the change, then rested it back down. Outside, wind moved through the trees, low and sustained, not sharp. Snow drifted lightly again, just enough to soften the darkness beyond the glass. Minutes passed. Daniel reached for the blanket he had placed earlier and folded it once more, tighter this time. He set it back on the chair beside him instead of handing it over. The choice was small, intentional, unexplained. Lena saw it. She did not react. She stood and walked toward the window, resting her hand lightly against the glass. Her reflection overlapped with the darkness outside, her outline doubling, then dissolving as the snow thickened. You work like you were passing time, she said. The words were not sharp. They were not gentle. They were accurate. Daniel did not answer immediately. He watched the fire instead, as if waiting for it to respond first. Sometimes, he said finally. Lena nodded once, accepting the answer exactly as it was. Silence returned, heavier now, but still intact. She moved away from the window and sat again, this time with her hands resting flat on her thighs. Her breathing slowed without effort. The room followed. Daniel became aware of his own breath in response, the way it moved through his chest and settled. In Alaska, the cold taught you to notice these things early, to adjust before they became problems. The husky stretched and repositioned itself, settling closer to Lena's side now, its body forming a quiet boundary between them. Daniel did not move it. He leaned back slightly, eyes tracing the line where wall met ceiling, then returning to Lena without appearing to do so. She was not looking at him. She was listening, not for words, for shifts. Daniel reached for his phone, then stopped before touching it. He left his hand where it was for a moment, fingers resting against the wood of the table, then withdrew it. Entirely. Lena saw that too. She did not ask why. The fire cracked softly, sending a brief spark upward before settling again. Daniel stood and adjusted the log, careful not to disturb the balance. He knelt briefly, then rose, returning to his chair. When he sat, the distance between them felt wider. Not because either of them had moved away, because neither of them moved closer. "You do not owe this place anything," Lena said, her voice low. Daniel looked at her now. She met his gaze without challenge, without invitation. "I know," he said. Another pause. "You also do not take from it," she added. He considered that longer. Outside, the wind paused as if listening. "No," Daniel said. The answer did not explain itself. It did not need to. Lena looked down at her hands, then back up. She nodded once, as if a quiet box had been checked, something set back into alignment. The tension did not dissolve. It settled. They remained like that for a while, the space between them holding more than it had earlier, but not collapsing under it. The kind of space that asked nothing but attention. For anyone listening, this was the moment where the body wanted to lean forward, to fill the gap with sound or movement, to resolve something that had not asked to be resolved. Instead, the room invited something else. A slower breath, a longer pause. If you were there, you might notice your shoulders drop without instruction. You might realize you were holding your breath and let it go, quietly, without needing to be told. Daniel stood again, this time to check the door latch. He pressed it once, then stepped back. Lena mirrored the motion at the window, pulling the curtain a few inches tighter. Neither spoke. When Daniel returned to his chair, he sat slightly farther back than before, aligning himself with the rhythm of the room rather than the person across from him. The husky shifted again, pressing briefly against both of them, then settling in the center. The fire burned lower. The night deepened. Nothing had been said that could not be taken back. Nothing had been offered that required a response. And yet, the question remained, unspoken and intact, hovering just long enough to keep the quiet from becoming empty. Not about who Daniel Frost was, but about whether stillness could hold. Two people without asking either of them to move first. The night loosened its grip slowly, not because anything had changed, but because the cabin allowed it to. By morning, the storm had moved farther north. The sky held a dull gray, heavy but stable. The temperature remained low, hovering near 8 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep the world honest. Daniel Frost was already dressed when Lena Harper stepped into the kitchen. He stood near the counter, pouring water into the kettle. His movements were precise, familiar. Nothing hurried, nothing deferred. Lena paused at the doorway. Not because she was unsure where to go, because she noticed something new. The folder was gone. The plain one that had rested on the shelf near the door the night before now sat closed on the far end of the table, angled away from both chairs. Not hidden, not offered, placed. Daniel did not acknowledge it. Neither did she. She moved toward the stove and set out 2 bowls. Not breakfast yet, just preparation. She left enough space between them to be intentional. Daniel noticed that too. The kettle heated, steam gathered and lifted, then vanished. Outside, the husky scratched once at the door, then waited. Daniel opened the door and let the dog out, holding it steady against the cold air. He closed it carefully, making sure the latch set fully. "You can take the trail past the ridge," Lena said, not turning around. The snow packed, well overnight. Daniel considered it. All right. He poured hot water into both bowls, then stepped back. Lena added oats without measuring. The routine found its shape. They ate without speaking. Not because something was wrong, because nothing required correction. After breakfast, Daniel stood and reached for his coat. He paused and stopped. "I will be gone for a few hours," he said. Lena nodded. "I will be here." The exchange carried no weight beyond what it was. "Nodu students requested. No permission implied." Daniel opened the door and stepped into the cold. The husky followed, disappearing into the pale light. Lena watched from the window until the 2 figures narrowed into the trees. She did not watch longer than necessary. The cabin returned to its quieter version of itself. Lena swept the floor. She restocked the shelf by the window. She wrote one short line in her notebook, then closed it. The day passed without markers. Daniel returned just before noon. He did not bring anything back with him. No supplies, no signs of urgency. His boots carried fresh snow, shaken off carefully at the door before he stepped inside. "You were right about the trail," he said. Lena looked up from where she Saturday it holds. He nodded. They moved through the cabin without crossing paths. Daniel hung his coat. Lena cleared the counter. The husky settled near the fire again, content. At one point, Daniel reached for the folder. He opened it. Inside were several pages, neatly stacked. No visible markings from where Lena stood. She did not shift to see them. She did not pretend not to notice. Daniel read through the pages once, then again. He did not react. When he finished, he placed them back inside and closed the folder. He did not put it away. Instead, he slid it slightly closer to the center of the table. The movement was subtle, intentional. Lena noticed. She did not reach for it. She stood and poured water into 2 glasses, placing one closer to Daniel than before, though still not within reach. A small distance, a clear one. Daniel accepted the water. Their eyes met briefly, not searching, not avoiding, just acknowledging that something had shifted without deciding what it meant. In the afternoon, they worked side by side without working together. Daniel checked the shed roof, tightening one loose edge. Lena organized supplies near the lodge. They moved in and out of each other's presence, close enough to be aware, far enough to remain separate. At one point, Daniel handed her a tool without explanation. She took it without comment. Later, she returned it to its place without asking where it belonged. She already knew. As the light faded again, they returned to the cabin. The fire came on. The lamps followed. Dinner was simple, familiar. Afterward, Daniel sat at the table again, this time without opening the folder. He rested his hands on the wood, palms down still. Lena sat across from him. "You can leave it here," she said, nodding toward the folder. Daniel looked at it, then back at her. "Yes," he said. He did not ask if she would read it. She did not ask what it contained. The boundary held. Later, when the husky shifted and pressed briefly against Lena's leg, Daniel adjusted. His chair slightly closer to the table. Not to her, to the space between. A small movement. Enough. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been claimed. But something had been placed where it could remain without being watched. In Alaska, that was often how trust began. Not by crossing a line, but by agreeing quietly on where it was. The morning began the way it had the day before, but it did not feel identical. The kettle heated at the same pace. The fire held at the same level. The snow outside rested where it had fallen overnight. Yet the cabin carried a different balance, subtle enough to miss if you were not paying attention. Daniel Frost noticed it immediately. He stood at the counter, slicing bread evenly, the knife moving with quiet certainty. Lena Harper set 2 plates on the table, placing them closer together than she had the night before. Not close, just closer. Neither of them acknowledged the change. The husky waited by the door, restless in a controlled way, tail low, ears alert. The weather had cleared enough to invite movement. The temperature sat near 12 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but workable. Daniel poured coffee and set the mugs down. Lena reached for one, then paused, switching which hand she used. A small adjustment. Unnecessary. Intentional. They ate. After breakfast, Lena pulled on her coat and gloves. "I'm going to check the South Trail," she said. Daniel nodded. "I will go as far as the ridge." They stepped outside together, closing the door firmly behind them. The snow crunched underfoot, firm and reliable. Their paths split gradually, not sharply, until distance placed its quiet line between them. Daniel moved steadily, following the curve of the ridge, eyes scanning the ground without hurry. The husky ran ahead, stopping often to look back, confirming position rather than seeking instruction. A short distance ahead, the dog slowed, then stopped. Daniel saw the shift immediately. He approached without urgency, kneeling to inspect what had caught the dog's attention. A thin layer of ice had formed over packed snow, sharp at the edges. The husky's paw was caught awkwardly beneath it, not trapped, but uncomfortable enough to halt movement. Daniel reached out carefully, breaking the ice with the edge of his glove. He did not pull. He did not rush. He freed the paw with 2 precise movements, then checked it. Once more, the husky shook itself, tested the ground, then leaned briefly into Daniel's leg before trotting ahead again. Daniel stood, brushing snow from his knee. No signal was sent. No message delivered. He continued on. Lena noticed the pause from where she stood farther down the trail. She did not call out. She waited until Daniel resumed his pace, then returned to what she was doing. Later, as they converged near the cabin again, the husky bounded ahead, energy restored, leaving a clean set of tracks in the snow. Lena glanced down at the paw as the dog passed her. "All right?" she asked, not to Daniel, not fully to the dog either. Daniel nodded. "Ice." She nodded once in return. They went back inside. The routine resumed, unchanged in form. Lena removed her gloves and placed them on the counter instead of hanging them immediately. Daniel hung his coat, then paused, moving it 1 hook closer to hers. The hooks were identical. The choice was not. Around midday, the quiet was interrupted by a sound that did not belong to the cabin. A soft knock. Daniel and Lena both turned toward the door. Neither of them moved at first. Daniel stood and opened it. A man from a nearby outpost stood outside, snow clinging to his jacket, breath visible in the cold air. He held a small package, wrapped plainly, addressed in careful handwriting. "Delivery," the man said. "Weather held long enough." Daniel took the package. "Thank you." The man nodded and left without further conversation. Daniel closed the door and placed the package on the table. He did not open it. Lena watched without asking. The husky sniffed the edge of the box once, then lost interest. The afternoon stretched again. Daniel returned to the shed to adjust the repaired beam, testing its stability. Lena organized supplies inside. The same motions as before, but her pace had shifted slightly, more fluid, less measured. At one point, Daniel's phone vibrated on the table. Once, he looked at it. This time, he picked it up. The screen lit briefly, then went dark as he turned it face down again. No words were spoken. The phone remained where it was. Lena noticed the movement, then returned to her work. As evening approached, Daniel opened the package. Inside was a single envelope and a folded document. He removed both and set them on the table. He read neither. Instead, he closed the box and slid it beneath the shelf near the door. The envelope remained on the table. Lena sat across from him, hands resting loosely in her lap. She did not lean forward. She did not look away. "You can use the back room if you need quiet," she said. The offer was neutral, not curious, not careful. Daniel considered it. "I am fine here." She nodded. "All right." Dinner followed. The same meal as the night before. Prepared the same way. Served the same way. But when Daniel reached for the salt, Lena slid it closer without looking up. The timing was exact. After they finished eating, Daniel folded the envelope once and placed it inside the folder that still rested on the table. He closed it and did not move it farther away or closer. Lena stood and checked the door latch, then the window. The actions mirrored earlier ones, but the rhythm was smoother, less tentative. The huskies settled between them as the fire burned low. Outside, the forest shifted with nightfall, wind threading quietly through the trees. Inside, the routine held again, but now it carried the imprint of movement. A pause that had been filled, a task done without spectacle, a piece of the past delivered and set aside without ceremony. Nothing had broken the tone. Nothing had demanded attention. And yet, the day no longer felt still. It felt occupied, not by answers, but by the sense that something once distant had stepped closer without asking permission and had been allowed to stay. Morning came with a cost, though it did not announce it as one. The temperature dropped further overnight, settling near 2 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that did not threaten but required attention. The cabin responded as it always did. The stove held. The walls kept their promise. Outside, the snow hardened into a thin crust that carried sound farther than before. Daniel Frost woke early and stepped outside to check the path. The beam he had set at the shed held straight, but the door resisted when he pulled it open. Not broken, just stiffened by the cold. He adjusted the latch once, then again, easing it back into alignment. The effort took longer than expected. Inside, Lena Harper noticed the absence before she noticed the reason. The kettle, heated. The mugs waited. The husky paced near the door, restless but contained. Daniel returned with snow clinging to his coat and a faint scrape along the back of his glove. He set the glove on the counter and flexed his hand once, then again, as if checking the range of motion rather than the cause. Lena saw the mark. She did not comment immediately. They ate breakfast as usual. The routine did not change its shape. But when Daniel reached for the mug with his right hand, he adjusted mid-motion and used his left instead. Lena placed the honey closer to him than she normally would. The distance was minimal. The intention was not. Afterward, Daniel stood to clear the table. He paused when he reached for the bowls, then completed the task without assistance. Lena watched. She did not intervene. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the sound of movement across the snow. The day looked workable. Not easy. Not difficult. Daniel pulled on his coat. "I will check the ridge," he said. Lena nodded. "The ice will still be there." Daniel adjusted his gloves, testing the fit once. He stepped outside alone. Time moved. Lena sorted supplies at the lodge, noting a small discrepancy in the log. She corrected it without writing an explanation. The huskies slept near the stove, shifting occasionally as the heat adjusted. Daniel returned later than usual. His pace was unchanged, but his left shoulder sat slightly lower than before. The detail was easy to miss. Lena did not miss it. "You took the long way," she said. Daniel nodded. The trail drifted. She waited. "That will happen again tonight," she added. "Yes," he said. She did not ask if he would go back out. He did not say whether he would. Inside the cabin, Daniel set his coat down more carefully than before. He tested the glove again, then folded it and placed it near the stove, closer to the warmth. Lena poured water into a small pot and set it to heat. She did not say why. When the water warmed, she placed the pot on the table and set a clean cloth beside it. She did not look at Daniel while she did this. He sat. She dipped the cloth and wrung it out, then slid it across the table. Daniel looked at it for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He pressed the cloth lightly against his knuckles, holding it there without reaction. The movement was precise, controlled. Lena stood and stepped back, leaving space. The action cost something. Not pain. Time. They sat like that for a while, the room adjusting around them. The fire burned. The light shifted. Outside, snow moved in shallow waves across the ground. Daniel removed the cloth and folded it once before setting it aside. "I will manage," he said. Lena nodded. "I know." The words landed without challenge. Later, as evening approached, Daniel reached for the folder on the table. He opened it and read one page this time, then another. His hand paused once, just long enough to be noticed. Lena was at the counter, cutting vegetables evenly. She did not look up. The rhythm of the knife did not change. Daniel closed the folder and set it aside. Dinner followed. The same meal, prepared the same way. But when Daniel reached for a plate, Lena was already holding it out. Their hands brushed briefly. Neither of them pulled away quickly. Neither lingered. After the meal, Daniel stood to check the shed latch again. Lena followed him outside without being asked. The cold pressed in immediately. Daniel adjusted the latch. It held. Lena stood nearby, hands in her pockets, watching the edge of the structure rather than him. "This will cost you a glove," she said, nodding toward his hand. Daniel glanced down. "Yes." She waited. "You can leave it here," she added, meaning the work. The place. The unfinished edge of the day. Daniel considered the shed. The path. The trees beyond. "I will," he said. They went back inside together. The huskies settled between them again. The fire burned low. Nothing had escalated. Nothing had resolved. But the day had taken its price. A slowed movement. A shifted reach. An action met with care rather than correction. The routine held. And in holding, it made room for the understanding that even quiet choices carried weight, and that staying came with costs that could not always be measured, but were felt all the same. The night after the cold held a different shape. Not quieter. Not louder. just clearer. Daniel Frost woke before the first trace of light reached the trees. The cabin was still. The stove had burned down to embers that held warmth without flame. Outside, the temperature hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind that made sound travel farther and intentions feel heavier. He sat at the table with the folder open in front of him. Only one page lay exposed. He did not read it again. He rested his hand beside it, fingers spread flat against the wood, feeling the grain beneath his palm. The surface was worn smooth by years of use. Not polished. Maintained. Across the room, Lena Harper slept on the couch, wrapped in a blanket pulled high over her shoulders. She had fallen asleep there without planning to. No shoes. No tension in her posture. The husky lay at her feet, angled toward the door, alert even in rest. Daniel did not stand right away. He watched the room instead. The chairs placed where they had been left. The kettle on the stove, empty but ready. His glove near the warmth, dried enough to be used again. The folder, open but untouched. The cabin did not ask anything of him. That was when it settled. Not as a thought. Not as a decision. As a recognition. He closed the folder. Not sharply. Not carefully. Just enough. He slid it back onto the shelf near the door, placing it behind the box that had arrived the day before. Not hidden. Not prioritized. Placed. Daniel stood and moved quietly through the cabin, adding a log to the stove, adjusting the flame lower than before. He poured water into the kettle and set it to heat. The husky lifted its head briefly, then settled again. Lena stirred a few minutes later, waking without urgency. She sat up slowly, taking in the room as it was, not searching for change. "You're up early," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. No explanation followed. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stayed where she was. She did not rise immediately. She did not ask what he was doing. She watched the steam rise from the kettle and disappear. Outside, the sky lightened gradually, a muted gray pushing against the dark. Snow rested untouched, carrying the shape of the night intact. Daniel poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one near the edge of the table. Not where Lena sat, close enough to be reached if she wanted it. She noticed. She stood and crossed the room, taking the mug without comment. They drank in silence. This time, the silence did not lean forward. It stayed. Lena glanced toward the shelf by the door, noticing the folder where it now rested. Her eyes moved back to Daniel. He met her gaze, then looked away first. Not to avoid it, to leave it alone. "I'm going to the lodge later," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know. I may not be back before dark." "That is fine." She waited a moment longer, as if checking whether more needed to be said. Nothing did. After breakfast, Lena put on her coat and boots. She moved with her usual care, lining things up where they belonged. Before she opened the door, she paused. "The trail by the ridge will freeze again tonight," she said. "If you go out, take the longer path." Daniel considered it. "All right." She nodded and stepped into the cold, closing the door behind her. Daniel remained where he was. The cabin held. He cleaned the table, wiped the counter, and sat again, hands resting flat in front of him. He did not open the folder. He did not reach for his phone. Outside, the wind moved lightly through the trees, not enough to carry urgency. Hours passed. When Lena returned, the light was already fading. Daniel was stacking firewood inside, preparing for the drop in temperature. He looked up when he heard the door. "You're back," he said. "Yes," she replied. She removed her coat and hung it up. She noticed that his coat now hung beside it, not separated as before. She did not comment. They prepared dinner together without discussing it. The movements overlapped naturally, neither stepping aside more than necessary. When they sat down to eat, the space between them felt familiar, not measured. Halfway through the meal, Lena spoke. "You do not have to stay for the weather," she said. Daniel looked at her. "I know," he said. She nodded. "I wanted to say it." "I know." They finished eating. Later, as the fire burned low again, Daniel stood and checked the latch on the door. He pressed it once and let his hand rest there a moment longer than necessary. He did not test it again. He returned to his chair. The husky settled between them, weight warm and steady. Daniel leaned back, eyes tracing the ceiling, then closing briefly. Not to sleep, to rest where he was. If you were listening, this was the moment to notice your own breath, to see whether it had been shallow without you realizing it, to let it slow, not because someone told you to, but because nothing here required speed. Lena reached for the blanket and draped it across the back of Daniel's chair without touching him. He noticed. He did not adjust it. The fire held. The night deepened. Nothing had been named. Nothing had been promised. But something had been placed gently back where it belonged. And for Daniel Frost, that was enough to stay with the understanding that not every decision needed to be spoken aloud, and not every door needed to be closed and know where he stood. Morning returned without ceremony. The same pale light pressed against the cabin windows, filtered through snow and cloud. The temperature held steady near 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep the air sharp, calm enough to let routine continue uninterrupted. Daniel Frost woke before the light fully settled. He moved through the cabin as he always had. Boots on, stove checked, kettle filled, fire adjusted down rather than up. The motions were familiar, practiced, unchanged in form. And yet, they landed differently. The husky rose and followed him outside, paws crunching softly on the hardened snow. Daniel cleared the steps, restoring the narrow path from the door to the woodpile. He carried the logs in the same measured way, 2 at a time, placing them where they belonged. No hurry, no pause. Inside, Lena Harper woke a few minutes later. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat where she was, listening to the sounds she now recognized without thinking about them. The door opening, the scrape of wood, the quiet return. She stood when the kettle began to steam. 2 mugs came down from the cupboard, not arranged, just placed. Daniel poured the coffee and set the mugs on the table. He did not look to see if she was watching. She was. They sat across from each other, the table between them unchanged. Same distance, same chairs, same light. But the quiet no longer felt like something that needed guarding. Outside, the forest rested. Snow lay untouched except for their tracks, already beginning to soften at the edges. After breakfast, Daniel washed the bowls and set them aside to dry. Lena folded the towel and placed it back where it belonged. Neither of them checked the other's work. They moved on. Daniel put on his coat and reached for his gloves. He paused, then chose the pair that had dried by the stove rather than the newer one hanging by the door. A small decision, unremarked. I will walk the ridge, he said. Lena nodded. The long way still holds. I know. He stepped outside. The husky followed, then stopped briefly at the door, glancing back at Lena before continuing on. Lena watched them go, then turned back to the cabin. The day unfolded in pieces. She worked at the lodge, organizing supplies, updating the handwritten log. The routine was the same as before. Shelves straightened. Items returned to their place. The rhythm steady. But she noticed herself slowing in places where she used to rush. Daniel returned mid-morning, snow clinging to his boots. He brushed it off carefully before stepping inside. The folder remained on the shelf by the door. Unmoved. He did not look at it. They crossed paths in the kitchen without stopping. A shoulder close enough to notice warmth through layers. Neither stepped away. Lunch followed the same pattern as always. Soup reheated. Bread sliced evenly. The fire adjusted lower instead of higher. Afterward, Daniel sat at the table and opened his book. Lena sat near the window and wrote one line in her notebook, then closed it again. They did not fill the space with words. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, then settled. The sky remained overcast, light diffused, forgiving. In the afternoon, Daniel repaired a loose board near the back of the cabin. He worked without tools at first, testing it with his hands, then retrieved what he needed and finished the task cleanly. Lena brought him a mug of water and set it down within reach. Not handed, placed. He drank, not at once. As evening approached, the cabin filled with the familiar glow of lamps and firelight. Dinner came together without discussion. Each of them knew when to step in and when to step back. They ate. Afterward, Daniel checked the latch on the door. Once. Enough. Lena drew the curtain an inch closer, then stopped. The husky settled between them, weight warm and steady. Nothing had been restored, because nothing had been broken. The routine was the same. The cabin was the same. Alaska was the same. But the space between two people once carefully maintained, now held something else. Not expectation, not promise, just a quiet understanding that returning to what was familiar did not mean returning unchanged, and that sometimes the truest sign of movement was not what you added to your life, but what you no longer needed to keep separate. The night arrived without sharp edges. It settled over Alaska the way snow did when the wind had nothing left to argue about. The temperature dropped gently, hovering near 0 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but steady. The forest outside the cabin darkened into layers of quiet, each one softer than the last. Inside, the lights were low. Daniel Frost stood near the window, looking out at the stretch of snow that held their track from earlier in the day. The edges had already begun to blur. Alaska had never kept records for long. Behind him, Lena Harper folded the blanket from the chair and placed it back where it belonged. Not because it needed to be done, because it was time. The husky shifted once, then settled near the door, body angled toward the night, content to guard what did not need protection. Daniel turned away from the window and checked the stove. The fire burned evenly, just enough to hold the warmth through the night. He adjusted the damper a fraction lower and stepped back. Lena watched without speaking. They moved through the cabin in parallel. Two paths that did not cross sharply, but remained close enough to share the same space without effort. Daniel placed a mug in the sink. Lena dried it and set it aside. The rhythm held. Later, Daniel reached for his coat and stopped. He hung it back on the hook. The choice was small. It stayed. Lena noticed. She did not react. She turned off the lamp near the table, leaving only the soft glow by the stove. They sat. The quiet was no longer something they entered carefully. It met them where they were. Outside, the wind returned briefly, brushing the walls before moving on. Snow followed, light and sparse, enough to be seen, not enough to matter. Daniel leaned back in his chair, hands resting where they fell. Lena sat across from him, posture easy, unguarded. The husky's breathing filled the space between them, slow and even. If you were listening, this was the moment where your own breathing might match it without intention, where the day, whatever it had carried, could be set down without ceremony. Daniel stood and checked the door latch one last time. He pressed it once and left it there. Enough. Lena drew the curtain a fraction closer, then stopped, leaving a thin line of darkness visible. The outside world remained present, but distant. They did not speak. Nothing required words. The cabin held its shape. The routine held its meaning. Daniel looked once toward the shelf by the door where the folder rested, untouched. Then he looked away. Lena followed his gaze, then returned her attention to the fire. The night deepened. Alaska did not ask what came next. It only offered another quiet stretch of time, wide enough to rest in. As the lights dimmed further and the room settled into sleep, one thought remained unspoken, open and unforced. Tomorrow would arrive the same way it always did. And when it did, the door would still be there, waiting to be opened or left closed, without needing an answer tonight.